Thank you very much, Professor Talbot, for that kind introduction. Before I begin, I should say, anybody who's counting pages, don't panic. I'm using very large type here, so it won't be that long. Also, for those of you who are signed up members of Performance, local and international, there will this evening be recorded performance, live performance, and there'll even be some improvisation, but not too much. I realized early on in my efforts to comprehend the art form, drama, and acts of theatre and performance, that these fictional worlds had an intense relationship with actual human worlds, both the worlds out of which they emerged and the worlds into which they played. This meant that in order to study the fictional, what Fintan O'Toole calls lies that tell the truth, I had to investigate and account for the actual, what was accepted as reality. And searching out the real involves engaging with contests over naming the world. The cultural politics of representation and interpretation, the power to influence what becomes accepted as the way things were, the way things are, and even the way things will be. This evening's lecture seeks to bring together in constellation, in David Lloyd's phrase, a series of moments in time and moments in theatre in an effort to explore the implications of Daniel O'Quinn's conclusion that the theatre tends to bridge the conceptual gap between realms understood to be explicitly political or economic and those understood to be specifically private and social. I will begin with a sketch of some important ideas and events in the history of how Ireland has developed since the mid-19th century, because plays are thoroughly implicated in that history, whether reflecting, contesting, or indeed conjuring a nation into being. I will draw on material from my monograph, Because We Are Poor, Irish Theatre in the 1990s, and my forthcoming essay, Holes in the Ground, Critical Performance Practices in 21st Century Ireland. Ireland is a small country, and in small countries, big changes, such as those precipitated by modernity, can happen very quickly. Irish modernity is a two-phase experience, colonial modernity and neo-colonial modernity. In countries which have experienced colonisation, deep socio-economic changes have a mystifying quality, as they appear as visitations from a metropolitan centre in which the aspirations and welfare of the colonised count for very little. Put simply, the story of Ireland's relationship with modernity might be rendered as a narrative in which as soon as people think they have some reliable sense of where they are and what's going on, something happens. Chris Morash's reflection on theatre and the Republic of Ireland Act 1949 is tellingly titled, Something's Missing. It might just as easily have been called Something Happened. There is a doubleness at work here, in that any event in Irish history is always rebuked by its opposite. Most happenings are evolutionary, and some, usually those which receive most attention, are revolutionary. As evolution takes its gradual course, revolution may be invoked as more necessary and vice versa, so that the national narrative is a tale of radical incompleteness. A sense of lack or of incompletion, of something missing, pervades both everyday life and cultural production. For instance, in my own hometown of Wexford, that lack is acknowledged in demotic speech. One phrase that never stops to amuse me and puzzle me at the same time. I'm going to tell you one thing, and it's not two. It even appears, this sense of lack, in reverse in the statement. There's only two fellas like that in Wexford, and he's the two of them. At the end of Mark Doherty's play, Trad, we see Father, who is 100 years old, and his only son, a 70-year-old man with one arm, boating on a lake. Father slips quietly out of the boat to disappear into the water below. The final image of the play is of Son paddling helplessly around in a circle, unable to steer a course because his one arm cannot control the movement of the boat. This moment recalls in action a frequently quoted line from Tom Murphy's Conversations on a Homecoming. The two of you together would make one decent man. Trad is set in 2004, the centenary year of the Abbey and Peacock Theatres, the National Theatre of Ireland. Father is as old then as the National Theatre, and the hapless figure of the son circling aimlessly in the middle of a lake offers a fertile metaphor for a society out of touch with its own history. The nation's abiding incompleteness is linked by political economist Peadar Carney to the weak relationship between state and civil society inherited from colonial times. A fundamental weakness indeed, as the terrain of civil society has the potential for setting a different developmental direction for the Irish state. Civil society, Kirby argues, is the site on which the social struggle to gain the power to define the developmental project will be resolved. As an appeal to the people over and above the institutions, this is grounded in an idea that the people's authority and aspirations are always more than the state can or will respond to. It's an uncomfortable idea, suggesting that the nationalist people nation cannot point to any tangible entity as its home. The name of the state, for instance, is the Irish Free State from 1922 to 49, the Republic of Ireland since then, and in the Constitution of 1937 it is Éire in the Irish language version, which takes precedence legally, or Ireland in English. Small wonder then that to achieve some consistency on the object of study, historian Ronan Fanning published Independent Ireland in 1983. So the nation then is not a place outside of official discourse. It is not a story whose details are broadly accepted. In these circumstances then, it's not unreasonable to regard the nation instead as a series of performances along a spectrum from national romance to national tragedy. And theatre is at the heart of the national narrative during the 20th century. Lady Augusta Gregory, John Millington Synge and William Butler Yeats founded the Abbey Theatre in 1904, a significant intervention into the cultural politics of Irish nationalism. Interestingly, Lionel Pilkington has shown that while it was culturally bold, the intention of the Abbey was politically quietist. Ireland in the early 20th century was actually engaged in a rather sedate progress towards home rule within the UK. Mr. Salmon, take note. When rebellion broke out then in Dublin at Easter 1916, it was a happening which came as a great shock to the majority of people and attracted little public support. Jim Moran shows the rebellion to have been profoundly performative, even theatrical, an event staged with an eye not on victory, but on historical impact. The execution of the rebel leaders ensured that the consequences of the event and its enduring effects on public life in Ireland would be of a significance captured in the rich ambiguity of Yeats's poetic refrain, "A terrible beauty is born." Revolutionary political gestures, though, are actually very rare in Irish history, especially when compared to the relentless impact on ordinary people of capitalist extraction under colonialism, and as we shall see, under neo-colonial native government. Poverty and hardship were constant features of Irish life for many centuries, and since the Great Famine of the 1840s, the typical response to economic collapse has been to emigrate. This means that Ireland's culture, economics and politics have always been haunted by missing persons, those who left. But not all emigration happened for solely economic reasons. the writer Frank O'Connor excoriated the governance of independent Ireland as a new establishment of church and state in which imagination would play no part, and young men and women would emigrate to the ends of the earth, not because the country was poor, but because it was mediocre. This was certainly the case with playwrights and other artists, as the biographies of Samuel Beckett, Sean O'Casey, Bernard Shaw and James Joyce make clear. In Beckett's All That Fall, Mrs. Rooney declares, "It is suicide to be abroad." But what is it to be at home, Mr. Tyler? What is it to be at home? A lingering dissolution. These lines were written in Paris, almost 30 years after Beckett had emigrated, demonstrating that if those who remained settled for less, those who left carried a wounded Ireland with them and worked it over in their writings. Such is the lot of the exile, singing, in the words of Edward Said, the lyrics of loss as consolation for the indefinite postponement of the drama of return. To risk return can be fatal, as Dermot Bulger's The Lament for Arthur Cleary demonstrates. The play is a fictional meditation on a historical figure, Arto Lera, who returned from service with the Hungarian Hussars and was shot dead in 1773 by the Sheriff of Macroom, County Cork, for refusing to surrender his horse, which he, a Catholic, had no right to possess under the penal laws. Bulger's Arthur also loses his life on returning and confronting criminality in 1980s Dublin, which in his absence had become the heroin capital of Europe. The ancient myth of Uiscin in Tiernan Og haunts both narratives and underpins Billy Roach's play, Poor Beast in the Rain. Those who return confront those who had stayed, ambition's gravediggers, usurpers of the levers of state power purchased by revolutionary sacrifice. This usurper class, Frantz Fanon's nationalist bourgeoisie, constructs those who left as uprooted, feckless and enthralled to fantasy. Against this, it figures itself as grounded, in control, dealing with reality. So what was the reality of 1950s Ireland? Well, Breen and others, sociologists, describe that reality as lived by countless thousands of ordinary people as follows. We see here that 400,000 persons left to seek employment, mainly in Britain, in one decade. Approximately 1 person out of every 5 born since independence in 1922 and resident in 1951 had emigrated by the end of the decade. For those in younger age groups, the rate of departure was nearly twice as great, and in many years, emigrants almost equalled the number of births. As the pressure generated by this hemorrhaging mounted, the state turned its back on this reality and on the pursuit of either equality or solidarity, producing an official discourse which took refuge in a fantastical myth of a free country, a great little country. In Katie Hayward's analysis, a key objective of official nationalism in the emergent independent Ireland was to play down the primary anti-colonial aspiration to collective liberation and personal redemption in a nation achieved. Tom Hall's description of neo-colonial Mexico is suggestive here. Living there is like standing under a stone arch which stays standing only because all the stones want to fall down at the same time. In the early decades of independence, then, actual experience drifted further and further from any prospect of a better life, and Republican ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity came to reside exclusively in empty rhetoric. All the while, and especially in electoral contests, public mythology asserted that a new thing or new times, or both, were just around the corner. Peadar Kirby argues that by such means, Irish elites achieved the power to dominate discourse and allow little space for the consideration of alternatives. Now, the implications of that discursive domination were so real that Tom Garvin's book on economic and social policy from the 1930s to the 60s, Preventing the Future, addresses the question, why was Ireland so poor for so long? The hyperactive years from 1992 to 1999 were marked by an explosive acceleration in economic activity, which produced a public narrative of doing very well indeed. To the irritation of the comfortable, prosperity was accompanied by increased visibility of Europe's racial others on the streets of Ireland's towns and cities. This social turn played out against the background noise of bitter local debates over the cultural meaning of images of Irish bodies, revolutionary and abject, during the 150th anniversary of the famine and the bicentenary of the 1798 rebellion. The economy was booming, so real economic power was now at issue, and along with it, the prospect of a seat in the front row at globalization's big show. As in the economy, the 1990s was a time of extraordinary activity in Irish theatre, when funding increases supported new companies in cities and towns across the country. And in parallel with the public debates I've mentioned, the theatre diverged around stagings of Ireland's past. I want now to consider two plays, one from 1990 and one from 1968, but restaged in 1993. Both productions took place on the main stage of the Abbey, the National Theatre. The title of this lecture is a quotation from Brian Friel's Dancing at Lunasa, which was a huge success in Ireland, where it was embraced as a compliment to President Mary Robinson's open invitation, "Come dance with me in Ireland." It toured globally to ecstatic receptions, picking up Tony Awards along the way, and is retrospectively numbered, along with Riverdance, among the icons of Ireland's successful, a performative harbinger of the economy's performance as the poster child of globalization. Needless to say, there is both a great deal less and a great deal more to the play itself. Within 2 years of its premiere, the director of Dancing at Lunasa, Patrick Mason, was appointed artistic director of the National Theatre, and he set about restating some foundational questions about both drama and nation. Why found a stage for a nation's stories? Who can narrate such stories, and how? For whom and to whom are they to be told? These questions resonate at the very core of Dancing at Lunasa. The question of narrative voice is highly problematic in all Brian Friel's work, and in Dancing at Lunasa, the narrator, Michael, constructs the remembered world of the Mundy sisters around events of significance in his own life. Michael's use of distance and nostalgic tone averts the gaze from the relationship between the socio-economic predicament of the Mundy women, the inequalities of Ireland in the 1930s, and the endurance of those inequalities in 1990s Ireland. In short, his way of remembering the lives of poor rural women is in itself a form of amnesia. The remembered action of Dancing at Lunasa takes place in 1936 as parliamentary draftsmen were finalising the text of the 1937 Constitution. That document cast in stone a society in which the life opportunities available to the rural poor were drastically limited. The play's denial of the realpolitik involved in the daily struggle to live an ordinary life reaches its height in the pivotal dance scene, on which Joe Cleary comments. Audiences usually perceive this dance in wholly positive terms, as a liberating outburst of repressed energy that expresses the pent-up protests of the sisters against De Valera's Ireland. The dance is a sensual frenzy then, but its rapture is not a wholly positive one. There are suggestions of a disfiguring surrender to cruelty and pain as well. By the opening of Act 2 of the play, the world of Act 1 has been dismembered, and these poor women living at the margins of the national ideal have met change with self-sacrifice, ending up either as servants of others or unskilled economic migrants. Dancing at Lunasa does not explore the women's personal tragedies during the 40s and 50s, but returns to the 1930s homestead as a memorial site from which the narrator, Michael, may still draw sentimental consolation. For Joe Cleary, then, the play's impact is reactionary. He concludes, unable to identify substantive historical options, the narrative consigns the sisters to their doom, settles for a kind of postmodern playfulness, the music of Anything Goes plays out the piece, and seeks no positive value outside art or the formal order of ceremony. This is a sobering judgment indeed on the net effect of the most successful Irish play of the 1990s. Friel's narrator Michael speaks to us, though, from the 1960s. And in 1968, Ireland was in expansive mood. There was an economic boom, cheered on by a series of local television celebrities who seemed to confirm that we could have America at home. It felt like another new beginning. But alongside the carnival of conspicuous consumption, the reality of emigration, economic and spiritual poverty endured. Into this social dynamic, Tom Murphy inserted a drama of the ultimate colonial horror. No other event has left as deep a scar on Irish consciousness as has the terrible suffering and injustice of the Great Hunger. Famine reopens and excavates that wound in an effort to forge metaphors for the country's decline in the years since independence. First produced at the Peacock Theatre in 1968, revived by Druid Theatre Company in 1984, and by Gary Hines at the Abbey in 1993, Famine is a drama from the abyss, rich in examples of the doubleness of experience and desire. In terms of Irish theatre practice, it is formally innovative, deploying epic dramaturgy, a powerful facilitator of critical historical drama, especially where extremes of human experience must be staged. The Ireland of Famine is a house of death, an impossible home in which irresistible, lethal forces act upon the people. The wretched bodies of the 1840s are summoned like ghosts to speak to an accumulating hunger of the spirit. The doubleness of the dramatic world ensures that famine is not just about them then, but includes us now. What appears as a history play of the colonial past is always also a refusal of the ideological consensus at the core of independent Ireland. Scene 1, The Wake, introduces John Connor, headman of Glanconner, his wife and family. They are joined by neighbours assembled to mourn the loss of John's youngest daughter to famine fever. The mise-en-scène juxtaposes the private interior of the death house with the public gathering of men in an exterior space. On the outside, the men speculate on the prospects for the potato crop, thus providing the broader context for the child's untimely death, and exposing the social and economic forces in contention around the staple diet of the peasantry. Scene 1 thus inaugurates an unflinching engagement with unspeakable human suffering as the land's possessors extract maximum profit from its people. By the end of the play, John Connor and his eldest daughter Maeve are the only surviving members of the family. In scene 11, the Queen dies, John's wife demands that he kill both herself and their young son, Donal. Maeve witnesses him acquiesce in this, her family's ultimate degradation, and yet she and her father survive to see, in scene 12, the springtime, the long-postponed cornmeal arrive. Liam Dugan has survived the hunger by working for a land agent on the enforced resettlement of his neighbours to Canada, thus freeing the land they had occupied for productive use. He is Maeve's suitor, and when she rejects the loaf of bread he offers her, he offers it again.
No. There is nothing of goodness or kindness in this world for anyone. But we'll be equal to it yet.
Well, maybe it will get better.
No.
And when it does, we'll be equal to that too.
The loaf of bread comes at the price of relinquishing struggle, in gratitude to one's oppressor for mercy shown too late, but shown at last. That is the source of Maeve's tears. Famine stages the nadir of Irish humanity, and Gary Hines' 1993 production mapped it explicitly onto the divided society of the early days of the Celtic Tiger economy. Dancing at Lunasa has been seen worldwide. It is unlikely that famine will have such exposure. And so the role of critical commentary in enabling the play to speak to Irish history and Irish society is crucial. Richard Carney considers Tom Murphy an iconoclast of the consumerist Irish bourgeoisie who resent any deviant flight of creativity, force many of their artists into exile, and try to destroy those who remain. But Carney queries the cultural effectiveness of what he reads as an angry, at times apocalyptic attitude to contemporary Irish society in Murphy's work. He detects in the playwright a tendency to play the role of the poète maudit and finds what he calls Murphy's heroes responding to the threat of the irrational collective with a fierce individualism. The Nigerian Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka warns against critical dead ends produced by pursuing the seductive binary of individual society. The persistent search for the meaning of tragedy, for a redefinition in terms of culture or private experience, is at the least man's recognition of certain areas of depth experience which are not satisfactorily explained by general aesthetic theories. General theories such as Murphy's world or Murphy's heroes stand between reader and performance event. And when invoked, they close down engagement with the complexities of the actually existing drama. In Famine, as in many of Murphy's plays, the real contest is not between an isolated individual and a malevolent collective, but between competing social models, between opposing visions of collective living. That contest goes to the heart of the drama of Maeve's future choices, and her tears show that she recognizes all its cruel ambiguities. She emerges from deep trauma to contemplate not the possibility of a future, but a limited menu of available possibilities. Maeve's principled refusal both of bread and of the notion of ending recalls Luke Gibbons' observation that narratives in Irish culture offer no insulation from history and are only as resilient as their capacity to articulate the voices of those who have not been heard, rejecting the habits of authority that have enabled some to continually shout down others. Well, during the high point of the Celtic Tiger economy, there was a great deal of shouting down of alternatives, notoriously summarised in the dismissal of critics of his policies by Bertie Ahern, leader of the Fianna Fáil party and Taoiseach Prime Minister from 1997 to 2010. Sitting on the sidelines, cribbing and moaning is a lost opportunity. I don't know how people who engage in that don't commit suicide. That's the Prime Minister. Ahern is the pivotal figure of the period, whose reputation is captured in his sobriquet, the Teflon Taoiseach, which acknowledges that most of his tenure was overshadowed by serious corruption investigations. He countered a widely publicised verdict by his notorious mentor, Charles Haughey, that he was the most cunning, the most devious, the most ruthless of them all, with rhetorical strategies associating him with pints of Bass. Sir Alex Ferguson and Manchester United, Louis Walsh and Westlife, a tender aptitude for cultivating flowers in hanging baskets, and a mystical reputation as a deal broker. While he presided over the most aggressive neoliberal government in the EU, print and broadcast media energetically peddled his self-description as a socialist. We see him here, outside the Galway races, an annual event during which his party entertained a toxic caucus of builders, bankers, lawyers, accountants and journalists in a corporate hospitality tent. This was the same caucus that would visit bankruptcy on the country, leaving Ahern's successor, the hapless Brian Cowen, to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund, the European Union and the European Central Bank, the so-called Troika. Friends and colleagues, no words of mine can really describe this period, so this is the improvisatory section. Thank you, Dave. This is self-explanatory. This is what the high point of an economic boom looks like. This was an unprecedented intervention, front page of the Irish Independent newspaper on election day 1997. The relevant column is to your left. For years we have been bled white, now it's payback time. I don't know who the we was, but the owner of the paper is Sir Anthony O'Reilly. It's believed to have swung the election in favour of Mr. Ahern, seen in the foreground in typical pose. This is Mr. McCreevy. Mr. McCreevy was a finance minister. He later became EU Commissioner for Competition. I'm not a Eurosceptic, but there are times. Mr. McCreevy is pictured at the races. It should be champagne because he was known as Champagne Charlie, but I think it's whiskey. And he has his cute little badge there. Mr. McCreevy advised people during the years of the boom to spend, spend, spend. And when he was asked a mild question by a very, very mild-mannered television reporter, Tommy Gorman, he responded with, "Are you a commie, Tommy?" Oh, and these are the people who became incredibly popular among themselves, as Brendan Behan would say, during the boom. The chap over there, he's so good I have him twice, is a Cork solicitor called Gerald Keane. There he is again. The man with the pink shirt may be familiar to you. As far as I know, he's a perfectly harmless and decent person called Diarmuid Gavin. He's a gardener. The other chap, I think, is a rugby player. And the little fellow with red hair is a social columnist for the Independent newspaper group, the Sunday Independent paper, actually. That's Mr. Keane's lovely wife. Oh, and even the existence of a website like showbiz.ie gives you some sense of the cultural tone of what was going on. Oh, and this is good news. This is the sort of thing one heard on the radio during the period. This was announced to a grateful nation. It gets better. There's really nothing else you can say, but we have a visual. Ladies and gentlemen, America at home.
Guess which footballer's been caught with his pants down again?
Time to refresh your wardrobe.
Never thought I'd end up here, but I've the latest on today's big lunch.
Oh, will you finish the breakfast?
The big stories from the big names. Only 150 and only in the Irish News of the World.
You actually couldn't make that up. That, in case you didn't get it, that was Bertie Ahern, who had just left office as Prime Minister in a cupboard. Functioning as a hack for Murdoch's News of the World. Both of them now happily have gone to their just rewards. This is a very interesting one because the photographer was just lucky. This is the Troika. These are the representatives of the EU, IMF and the European Central Bank. And the man in the foreground there, the sort of Humphrey Bogart figure, is Mr. Chopra. The homeless man sitting there attracted some criticism because he wasn't Irish enough. Some people said he was a Roma, as if that disqualified the metaphorical power of the picture. You might be interested to observe that the green post box, if you can see on the right, actually says post office. That means that when independence came, that was red. And somebody went out with green paint and painted it over. So there's a whole lot of stuff, there are a whole lot of things colliding in terms of a post-colonial analysis of that image. Thanks, Dave. This sequence broadly summarises Ireland's descent from poster child of neoliberal globalisation to laboratory of austerity. So, how did Irish theatre respond to pressing questions raised by such dramas in the actual world? Well, 2 points are worth noting at the outset. First, the capacity of performance forms to engage the burning issues of the day is amply demonstrated in the case of child abuse scandals, both casual, as in Brian Desmond's and Martin de Cogoin's Thailand, What's Love Got to Do With It?, and institutional in Gerard Mannix Flynn's James X, the Abbey Theatre's The Darkest Corner series, and Louise Lowe's site-specific performance, Laundry. Second, I contest Fintan O'Toole's argument that Irish theatre more or less failed to engage with the venality of Tiger Ireland. The problem is partly that O'Toole was looking in the wrong place, on the main stage of the National Theatre, where there was evident scarcity. However, his charge cannot be sustained in the face of a number of direct challenges to Tiger hegemony and to its appetite for prey, in plays including Pádraic Breathnach and others' Sight, A Builder's Tale, Tom Hall, Boss, Pom Boyd and others, Boomtown, and David McWilliams' Outsiders. The time spanned by these works includes the statistical high point of Tiger's success, from 1999 to 2002, through to 2008, when a floundering government permitted the banks to collapse the economy, and on to 2010, as the public demand for answers and culprits resulted in what became known as a riot at the ballot box. All the plays listed here are about building and about the public culture produced by profits made from holes in the ground. Each play is haunted by the spectre of collapse and is a kind of premonitory shiver at the dereliction embedded in the very framework of the Celtic Tiger economy. They are very clearly not dramas of the actions of uniquely venal individuals. These plays dramatise systems of corruption, relationships and exchanges that enabled it to flourish on such a grand scale. So what's happened since? Well, since the collapse landed people in austerity Ireland, a search of Playography Ireland revealed 6 or 7 shows in the last 2 years, mainly in small Dublin venues, with titles such as Death of the Tradesmen, Perfidia, and The Great Goat Bubble. Unlike Sight, Boss, Outsiders, Boomtown and Thailand, however, These latter plays are introspective rather than provocative, a choice most obviously exercised in the most successful response to the banking debacle, Anglo the musical. Anglo is a satire on Anglo-Irish Bank, the most toxic of them all. It is a large-scale entertainment along the lines of the popular skit on Roy Keane's exit from Ireland's World Cup campaign in Saipan in 2002, which was called I, Keno. Anglo, according to Sarah Keating's review in the Irish Times, charts the last days of the economic boom as the bank that won't say no makes its final fatal gamble. There is a definite pleasure, she says, in recognising familiar faces amid the cartoonish grotesquerie. However, there is nothing too politically dangerous about Anglo the musical, and the lampooning of contemporary events already feels dated, a case of preaching to the converted. Well, it may be that someone in Ireland is working on a play about the overwhelming grotesquerie of a parliament no longer sovereign in its own country, taking dictation from the Bundestag in Berlin and the Treasury in London as to how it should allocate social spending. That's what's happening, by the way. The German Parliament reviews the Irish budget before the Irish Parliament does. And the Treasury in London, on foot of a 3.6 billion loan, has similar rights. If such a playwright is at work, I hope they will find a company prepared to put their play on. And I hope they will be inspired to combine witness with prophecy in the best traditions of the early Abbey playwrights. The necessity is great, and the explicit public engagement of President Michael D. Higgins, elected in 2011, provides an ethical context for reasserting the country's latent potential to be better than this. In conclusion, given Ireland's history, my title might have been Kate's line from Dancing at Lunasa. It's all starting to collapse. But Jerry Evans's line, you can see into the future from here, provides a graphic reminder that Irish theatre has prophetic capacities. And it's a tradition I hope artists will consider reviving. In Bernard Shaw's John Bull's Other Island, the prophetic voice is that of the defrocked priest Peter Keegan. This is his valedictory speech. When at last this poor, desolate countryside becomes a busy mint in which we all slave to make money for you, with our polytechnic to teach us how to do it efficiently, and our library to fuddle the few imaginations your distilleries will spare, then no doubt your English and American shareholders will spend all the money we make for them very efficiently in shooting and hunting, in operations for cancer and appendicitis, in gluttony and gambling, and you will devote what they save to fresh land development schemes. That grim prognosis dates from 1904, but maps almost exactly onto playwright M.J. Malloy's analysis of what actually came to pass 50 years later. For 40 years, Ireland has been free, and for 40 years it has wandered in the desert under the leadership of men who freed their nation, but who could never free their souls from the ill effects of having been in slavery. To that slave-born generation, it has always seemed inevitable and right that Anglo-American plutocracies, because they are rich, should be allowed to destroy us because we are poor. Destroy us, root and branch, through mass emigration. If theatre's big project is witness and prophecy, I suggest it will be most effective in tandem with a public project of a new social contract, a new direction for what Michael D. Higgins called 20 years ago a failed republic. Crony capitalism has failed. Territorial definitions of liberty have not responded in action to aspirations of solidarity and equality. It is past time to consult on a new beginning and to announce a theatre adequate to that project. The question as to whether and to what extent Irish theatre can enable people to imagine future, better possibilities is one not only for artists, but for publics, established and potential publics, and especially for critical interpreters who mediate acts of performance to the wider society and the wider world. Peter Keegan concludes his valediction. For 4 wicked centuries, the world has dreamed this foolish dream of efficiency, and the end is not yet, but the end will come. Given the state of collapse at which we have arrived, there is surely an ethical imperative to think critically and otherwise about what that history demonstrates. What if we abandoned a view of development as the pursuit of what Alain Badiou calls the desire for the West? Integration in modernity's pursuit of more and more has been tried and has failed repeatedly. David Lloyd argues that the integration of Ireland and the Irish into Western modernity is not only not the only story, but not the only possibility. What if we fail? Well, maybe we should rethink the meaning of success before beginning. Failure need not be seen as a negation of success, but as a stage in a better journey. Might it not be time to try for less of that and more of the other? And to take Samuel Beckett's description of life itself as guidance for collective living. Thank you.